On October 12, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a chartered aircraft, departed from Montevideo, Uruguay. The plane, just 4 years old with 792 flight hours, was en route to Santiago, Chile. It was piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Lagarara, an inexperienced co-pilot despite having 5,117 hours of flight experience. The flight carried 45 people in total, including 40 passengers and 5 crew members. Among the passengers were players of a rugby team, along with some of their friends and family. The journey was expected to be brief, typically lasting about 3 hours. However, the flight path crossed the towering Andes Mountains, the world's longest mountain range, known for its high peaks. While these mountains are breathtaking, they posed a severe challenge to the passengers on this journey. On that fateful day, a storm was raging in the Andes. The bad weather made it impossible for the plane to continue its flight. As a result, the pilots made the decision to land midway and planned to resume the journey the following day. The plane stopped for the night in Mendoza, Argentina. The following day, on October 13th, it took off again at 2:18 p.m., after the pilots confirmed that the weather had cleared. For the first hour, the flight was smooth and uneventful. At 3:21 p.m., the pilots began to descend as the aircraft neared Santiago. However, they were still flying over the Andes Mountains, which extend close to the city. During the descent, the plane suddenly encountered severe turbulence, shaking violently from side to side. Soon, dense clouds enveloped the aircraft, obscuring all visibility. Alarms blared, and warning lights flashed in the cockpit, though the reason was unclear. The rugby players seated in the passenger area didn't feel alarmed, treating the turbulence casually. But then, a horrifying sight emerged. A massive mountain loomed dangerously close. As the plane broke through the clouds, the pilots realized they were on a collision course with a towering rock face. Panicked, they scrambled to pull the plane upward in a desperate attempt to avoid disaster. As the ground collision alarm blared urgently, the pilots pushed the engines to maximum power, desperately trying to gain altitude and clear the mountain ahead. Unfortunately, it was too late. The rear of the aircraft struck the mountainside as it climbed, tearing off the entire back portion of the plane. The last 2 rows of seats were ejected, along with 3 passengers who vanished into the void. The plane managed to stay airborne for a few more seconds before plummeting downward. Another impact followed, this time ripping off the left wing, sending more passengers hurtling out of the plane to their deaths. What remained was the front section of the aircraft, which crash-landed on a glacier. It slid down the icy surface at a terrifying speed of 350 kilometers per hour, eventually coming to a violent stop after dropping 700 meters. The impact left the plane in ruins. Seats were torn loose from the fuselage, the cockpit was completely crushed, and both pilots were killed instantly. The wreckage lay stranded on an uncharted peak in the Andes, at an altitude of 3,500 meters. Remarkably, despite the devastation, 33 of the 45 people aboard survived the crash. Against all odds, they had lived through this catastrophic disaster. The situation for the survivors was dire. Many were injured, and their location was completely unknown. Later investigations revealed that the plane had deviated 80 kilometers from its intended flight path. This marked the beginning of a harrowing story of survival. At the time, no one aboard could have imagined the ordeal they were about to face. The crash of Flight 571 in the Andes Mountains involved 45 people, all of whom were initially presumed dead. This tragedy, however, would later come to be known as the Miracle of the Andes, for the extraordinary survival of some passengers. Among the survivors, 2 young men escaped with minor injuries: 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino, both medical students. Without wasting time, they began assessing the condition of their fellow passengers, checking for signs of life, and providing whatever help they could. They discovered that many had suffered serious injuries. Among them was 23-year-old Fernando Parado, who had fallen into a coma from a severe skull fracture. Canessa and Zerbino worked tirelessly to assist the injured survivors, doing all they could with the limited resources they had. Meanwhile, within an hour of the plane's disappearance, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was alerted. 4 aircraft were dispatched to locate the crash site. These planes searched relentlessly from dusk until nightfall, but unfortunately, they found no sign of the wreckage. Based on the radio transmissions, rescue service officers concluded that the plane had likely crashed in a remote, inaccessible location. Complicating the search, the aircraft's white color blended perfectly with the surrounding snow and ice, making it nearly impossible to spot in the snowy Andes. On the night of October 13th, the survivors remained hopeful. They believed that if they could endure the freezing night, rescuers would find them by morning. Tragically, 5 of the injured passengers succumbed to the cold that night, reducing the number of survivors from 33 to 28. The remaining passengers used the remnants of the plane's fuselage as shelter. They blocked the rear opening with luggage, seats, and packed snow to keep out the cold and preserve whatever warmth they could. The following day, October 14th, 11 aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay joined the search effort. The designated search area was accurate. The crash site was within its boundaries. Yet the wreckage remained undetected. In an attempt to attract attention, the survivors used lipstick to write SOS on the roof of the plane. However, they quickly ran out of lipstick and couldn't complete the message. Instead, they arranged suitcases in the snow to form a large cross, hoping it would be visible to search planes flying overhead. The survivors soon realized that their efforts to signal for help were not working. On that day, they spotted not 1, but 3 aircraft flying overhead. They shouted, waved their hands, and did everything possible to get noticed, but their attempts failed. Another day passed in frustration and despair. By October 15th, the survivors recognized their immediate need for water. One of the passengers, Fito Strauch, came up with an ingenious solution. Using a metal sheet as a solar collector, he harnessed sunlight to melt snow, collecting the water droplets in empty wine bottles. In addition, the passengers improvised with materials they had. Seat cushions were repurposed as snowshoes, and the wool from seat covers was used to protect against the freezing cold. On October 16th, 3 days after the crash, Fernando Parrado regained consciousness after being in a coma. Upon waking, he discovered the heartbreaking reality. His mother had died in the crash, and his 19-year-old sister Susana was critically injured. Parrado dedicated himself to caring for his sister, providing her with food and water. But despite his efforts, she succumbed to her injuries 8 days after the crash. Most of the passengers were from coastal areas and had never experienced snow before. Now they found themselves struggling to survive in extreme conditions, enduring temperatures as low as -30 degrees Celsius at a high altitude, with little food and water. Yet, they continued to hold on against all OD. The survivors faced yet another challenge: snow blindness. This condition occurs when the sun's ultraviolet rays reflect off snow and ice, causing damage to the eyes. With only 3 pairs of sunglasses available among the group, most were left vulnerable to this painful condition. On October 21st, 8 days after the crash, search and rescue teams officially abandoned their efforts. After 142 hours of searching with no signs of life, authorities concluded that survival was unlikely given the extreme conditions. The operation was called off, leaving the survivors entirely on their own. Amidst their struggles, the survivors discovered a transistor radio among the wreckage. Roy Harley, a rugby player with a passion for electronics, worked tirelessly to get it functioning. Using his ingenuity, he crafted a long improvised antenna, and his efforts paid off when the radio finally powered on. However, the device only allowed for one-way communication. While the survivors could listen to broadcasts, they had no way to send messages. On the 11th day after the crash, they tuned in and heard the devastating news. The search operation had been officially canceled. This announcement crushed their spirits. The realization that no one was coming to rescue them left the group overwhelmed with despair. Hearing the news that the search operation had been called off, Many survivors broke down in despair. Some cried uncontrollably, while others clasped their hands in prayer, pleading with God for salvation. The pain of realizing that the world believed they were dead was unbearable. Fernando Parado, however, remained calm. Unlike the others, he did not show much emotion. By then, he was already planning something else. By the 11th day, the survivors faced another dire challenge: a lack of food. Their meager supplies were almost gone. Initially, they had just 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, a jar of almonds, a box of peanuts, some dates, candies, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine. They began rationing these limited resources shortly after the crash, consuming only tiny amounts each day. Parado once survived on a single chocolate-covered peanut for 3 days. Despite their careful rationing, the food supply eventually ran out. At 3,800 meters above sea level, there was no vegetation or wildlife. As desperation set in, some survivors attempted to eat parts of the plane itself. They tried consuming the cotton from seat cushions and the leather from the seats, but this only made them sick. Facing the grim reality of starvation, the survivors found themselves at a horrifying crossroads. What they decided to do next would be shocking and unimaginable to most. When the survivors finally emerged from the snow cave, they saw a snowstorm approaching, so they wisely decided to return to their shelter to survive the harsh weather. For the next 3 days, they remained in the cramped space, struggling to endure. After 3 days, they emerged once more, only to find clear skies. But it quickly became clear that no one was coming to rescue them. If they were going to survive, they would need to take matters into their own hands. Sitting at the crash site and waiting for help was no longer an option. They had to fight for their lives with everything they had. Among the strongest survivors were Roberto Canessa, Fernando Parado, and Gustavo Zerbino. The 3 of them made the decision to take the most food and the warmest clothes they could find and attempt to walk in search of help. Their first step was to estimate their location. Before the crash, the co-pilot had mentioned they had passed through Curicó. Based on this information, the survivors thought that by walking a few kilometers west, they could reach the countryside of Chile. However, their assumption was far off. In truth, the co-pilot was unsure of their exact location when they were flying. In reality, their crash site was 89 kilometers east, deep in the Andes Mountains, but they were unaware of this at the time. After resting for a few days to regain their strength, the 3 survivors, Roberto Canessa, Fernando Parado, and Gustavo Zerbino, set out on November 15th, 33 days after the crash, hoping to find help. After traveling for hours to the east, they came across the rear section of the aircraft, the part that had separated first during the crash. Inside, they found a treasure trove of items: suitcases, boxes of chocolates, 3 meat patties, a bottle of rum, extra clothes, comic books, and some medicines. They also discovered the aircraft's 2-way radio system, which could not only receive messages, but could also send them. The 3 survivors decided to camp there for the night. The next day, as they continued their journey eastward, they discussed the possibility of using the aircraft's radio. They decided to retrieve some batteries from the main body of the plane and attempt to power up the radio. The survivors hoped to send out an SOS call using the aircraft's radio. They found a 1 battery in the tail section of the plane, but it was too heavy to carry back to the main wreckage site. So they decided to try to power the radio right there. They enlisted the help of Roy Harley, who had some knowledge of electronics, but unfortunately their plan failed. The problem was that the aircraft's electrical system used 115 volts AC, while the battery they had was 24 volts DC, and they had no way to connect them. Despite their best efforts over several days, they couldn't get the radio to work. They soon realized they had no choice but to start walking westward to find help. On December 11th, 59 days after the crash, disaster struck again. An avalanche hit, killing 3 more survivors. One of them recalled, "I was completely trapped by the storm and the avalanche. It was the deadliest silence you can imagine. I couldn't move. Now, only 16 survivors remained. As they prepared to climb the mountains to the west, they faced another challenge: how to survive the freezing nights with temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius. Among them was an 18-year-old boy named Carlos Miguel Rodriguez, who remembered that his mother had taught him how to sew with needles. He had his sewing kit with him. Carlos had an idea: to stitch together pieces of clothing to create a large sleeping bag for warmth. "I thought if we used the insulation, we could make a sleeping bag. And not only did I think of it, I made it myself," he later said. And so, they did. On December 12th, 2 months after the crash, the three brave men, Fernando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Gustavo Zerbino, set out to climb the glacier without any mountaineering gear. Their only certainty was that Chile lay to the west. However, to get there, they would first have to climb the mountain before descending. They still believed they were only a few kilometers away and hoped they could find help by walking for 2 to 3 days. So, they packed enough food for 3 days. As Parrado later described, "You can imagine, without any skill or training, it's like being a child. When you face a snowstorm and try to climb, you use your hands and feet, slipping and sliding. With every step you take up, you slide back half a step." To protect himself from the intense cold, Parrado wore 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters over a t-shirt, 4 pairs of socks, and even a plastic shopping bag over his socks. The cold was unbearable. They had no technical equipment, no map, no compass, and no climbing experience. At such a high altitude, the thin air made it difficult to breathe. Despite these challenges, they kept moving forward. At night, the sleeping bag they had stitched together provided warmth, and during the day, they trudged along slowly, taking one careful step after another. They slept as close as possible to each other in the sleeping bag, and as soon as the sun rose, they resumed walking. On the 2nd and 3rd days, they continued their journey, but on the morning of the 4th day, they realized their estimation had been gravely wrong. Ahead of them, there seemed to be no end to their journey. With very little food remaining, Gustavo Zerbino made the decision to return to the crash site, allowing the other two to continue so they would require less food. On December 15th, Zerbino began his descent, which was easier since it was all downhill. Using an aircraft seat as a makeshift sled, he reached the crash site in just an hour, a journey that had taken the others 3 days to climb. Meanwhile, Parrado and Roberto Canessa continued their climb. After 3 hours of grueling effort, they finally reached the summit. However, what they saw was disheartening. Endless mountains stretching in all directions, with nothing but snow-covered peaks as far as the eye could see. Parrado later described, "I couldn't breathe, I couldn't speak, I couldn't even think. What we saw was horrifying. Instead of green valleys, there were just mountains and snow-covered peaks all around us, 360 degrees to the horizon." Despite the overwhelming sight, Parrado managed to focus and noticed 2 snowless peaks in the far western horizon. They decided to head in that direction, knowing they couldn't give up. For days, they kept pushing forward, and eventually, they reached a valley. After trekking for 9 days, Parrado and Roberto Canessa finally reached a valley with a flowing river on December 20th. The sight of the river was a huge relief because traveling downstream would lead them to a downhill path. They continued walking, and finally, after days of exhaustion, they spotted something promising: cows grazing in a field. But they were so tired that they couldn't move any further. Then, on the other side of the river, they saw 3 men on horseback. Parrado attempted to shout, but the sound of the river drowned him out. However, one of the men spotted them and shouted back, "Tomorrow!" The next day, the man returned with paper and pencils. He attached them to a stone and threw it across the river, giving Parrado his first opportunity to communicate. Parrado quickly wrote a message in Spanish. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am from Uruguay and I've been walking for 10 days. My injured friends are at the crash site. We need urgent help, but we don't know how to get help. We have no food, we're weak, and we cannot walk any further. Please rescue us. Where are we?" The person who received the message was a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan. He understood the message and, after consulting with his two friends, recalled hearing about a plane crash a few months earlier. They were stunned to learn that survivors of the crash were still alive. Sergio threw a piece of bread across the river, then rode off for 10 hours heading west. Finally, he reached the nearest village, where he contacted the army in Santiago. Meanwhile, Sergio and the other farmers brought Parado and Canessa to Los Maitenes, where they were given rest and some care. It was revealed that, through sheer determination, Parado and Canessa had hiked 61 kilometers on foot over the past 10 days. Roberto Canessa had lost half of his body weight. Their story soon became international news. The Chilean Air Force dispatched 3 helicopters to rescue the remaining survivors. Army officers interviewed Parado and Canessa, gathering information about the crash site's location. Parado had a flight chart from the pilot and had marked their hiking path. He was taken on a helicopter to help pinpoint the crash site. With Parado's assistance, the location of the remaining survivors was finally pinpointed by the Army commanders. On December 22, 1972, 70 days after the crash, 2 search and rescue helicopters arrived at the crash site to rescue the survivors. In total, 14 survivors were saved, bringing the total number of survivors to 16, including Parado and Roberto Canessa. The survivors were in a terrible condition, suffering from altitude sickness, dehydration, broken bones, and malnutrition. Despite their harsh conditions, all of them made a remarkable recovery. This true story is a powerful testament to human endurance and resilience. In life, we often face challenges and struggles, and it's easy to lose patience or hope. Some even resort to extreme measures like suicide. But the incredible determination and willpower displayed by these survivors to stay alive, despite everything, is truly inspiring. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, perseverance can lead us to overcome the most unimaginable hardships. Thank you for watching, and do not forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.